Greetings folks and welcome to the Electromaker show. This is your midweek roundup of all things maker and embedded and lovely. And this week we will be looking at Milk5 among other things, but Milk5 is quite interesting. They are a company out of China and as the name may have suggested, they are working with RISC-V architecture. But they're not just putting out one kind of product. They have put out, or will be putting out very soon at least, have announced 3 separate boards. One full-size desktop board, one Raspberry Pi form factor board and one Raspberry Pi Pico form factor board. All at a fairly affordable prices for what they are, and all aimed at people who want to spin up their own things from scratch or just work with RISC-V architecture. It's a kind of interesting thing. We'll also be looking at some fantastic projects, some things on funding websites, all the usual good stuff we have here on the Electromaker show, and announcing the winner of our Grove IR sensor contest too. So, with all that to get through, let's get on with the show. We are going to start this week by looking at a project on the Electromaker website that has gone through several iterations, and it is a VU spectrum analyzer for music that uses an Arduino. And I know that some of you might hear that and think, well, isn't that just sort of a beginner-esque project, maybe a little bit more intermediate, but something that many people go through, and yes, that absolutely is the case. But the thing that sets this one aside is that in every iteration it has got a little bit better, a little bit more professional, to the point that it's become less of just a hobby project and more something that you might actually want to install in your home. Provided you like fancy LED flashy light shows, that is. So this is the video that is with it, and I'm going to play this in the hope that Hazi is using non-copyrighted music, or maybe this video will get a strike. But this is basically what you're seeing. This is an actually fairly professional looking box. If you put a little bit of diffusion in front of this, it could look like something that you purchased. As you can hear, there's a beat playing in the background, and the VU meter is moving in various different ways. And he could have just stopped and rested at that, a quite professional looking thing. But there's actually various different ways that this thing can be used. As you can see, he can press a button and make it into different variations of color and movement. And of course, as the music swells, you hear that things move a little bit differently. Yeah, it's just a really nice version of a project that you're probably already familiar with if you came up through the kind of what Arduino project do I do next. I've got some NeoPixels and I've got an Arduino, but here's where it gets interesting. In this project from HaziTech, I'm sure I already mentioned the name, but just in case I didn't, in this project from HaziTech, there's the video here, and as always, you can get the code. There's a link to the GitHub page just down here at the bottom of the page, and as always, I will make sure that this page is linked in our video description. But there's a link to 2 separate videos as well. So you can add Bluetooth to this lamp, which I thought was a very interesting concept. Now, you've seen most of this already. This is the box that we were just looking at, but laid out on a desk. Yeah, we have the speaker here, and just to give you a rough idea as to how this works, I'm going to actually, let's just skip back to here for a moment and look at the circuit diagram, because the wiring diagram, if I how do I make this large in a way that's going to be nice for you to see? Alright, I think this is a bit clearer. So what you're seeing here is the Arduino Nano that is running the show, and yes, you don't need a super high speed board in order to do this, because of the way that they're doing it, which is quite clever. Now, I'm not going to dive into the code at all here. If you're interested in finding out more about that, you can look at the GitHub. If you're interested in finding out what's going on here, there's a bunch of great tutorials into how you can read incoming audio on low-powered hardware and turn that into some kind of visualization. Yeah, there's multiple ways you can do it, and I'm not even going to open that kind of worms right here. But from a hardware perspective, it's quite interesting because we have the audio in here. I don't know if you can see my mouse. Let me just check. There we are. We have the audio in right here, and we have the audio out right here. And those are just linked, which is kind of elegant because it just means the audio goes straight in, straight out, losslessly, hopefully. And they are connected to the same ground that the board and everything else is. So yeah, there shouldn't be any issues there. But they also bridge out to the A0 and A1 pins. The audio in does, that is. Which means that the audio is also running into the Arduino in a way that can be read. And again, that's where the code comes in that I'm not going to talk about. And there's a few other options here as well. There's a sensitivity control down here at the bottom, which I know you can't see all that well, unfortunately. This potentiometer down here is sensitivity. This is a brightness control, a button for changing the pattern, and a button for changing the color. And then peak hold on or off, which is if you turn that on, obviously it'll just hold the peak lighting on instead of getting rid of it each time. Again, this is something if you've worked with music software before, you might be a bit more familiar with. And of course, the LED strips as well. And as you've seen at the start of this video, that in and of itself is a pretty nice looking project, right? You know, you can see that it has a quite professional looking box. I think it's just an off-the-shelf box that they've bought, like a junction box, but it looks pretty good. And the thing itself is, you know, by itself a good project. But Hazi wasn't finished with that. He said, okay, well, it works like this, but what about adding something wireless to it? So we get back to here again. Here is the same piece of kit just down on the floor. Obviously, this is where it attaches onto in the image you saw before. And they said, okay, well, how do we change this? Well, if we open it, if we look at this just here, you can see the Bluetooth audio receiver board that they've got here, and adding it to the inside of the box that they already have running right here. And if we look at the updated circuit diagram just here. There it is, got lost for a second. You can see that we have the same circuit that we had before, but as well as the audio in and out here, the Bluetooth audio receiver is added to this too. So the Bluetooth audio receiver goes to the output of this pin, but it also goes to the input here. So whatever Bluetooth audio is coming in is going to the Arduino Nano. It's also going directly out to the speakers. So whether you plug audio in directly or use Bluetooth audio, you're always going to get it going through the Arduino, and you're always going to be able to use the VU meter, which makes it a very hands-off, simple, just go and play your music device. Again, like I said, it takes it from just a random little project that you might do for fun to something genuinely useful that you might have in your home. Funnily enough, that is something that probably crossed HashiTech's mind as well, because... yeah, remember what I said at the start of this section about if you put a bit of diffusion on it, it might look even more like a lamp, like a professional product, like something you might want in your room. Well, Hashi thought of this too. In fact, Hashi made a new version of it which goes up the entire corner of a room and turns it into a reactive light that reacts to whatever music you're listening to. Yeah, it's an amazing thing. And as before, I'm not muting it because I don't want you to see it reacting to the music. I'm muting it because it's going to be very loud if I don't. But yes, it's the same deal. It's just in a much larger form factor. And as mentioned, this is something that is a little bit more kind of professional looking, even than the one before. Yeah, with diffusers and with things that go all the way up and down the wall, with a very similar setup. As you can see, instead of using LED strips, they're using individually accessible? No, that's not the word I'm looking for. Addressable. Individually addressable separate LEDs, which you can get whole strings off on AliExpress for quite cheap. And yeah, running that up the side of the wall using a metal clamp of their own devising. This is worth noting, by the way, that this is also a project in and of itself. You can extend that Arduino Nano project to be this corner lamp, or you can do your own version of it. This uses an ESP8266, which makes it a Wi-Fi controlled corner lamp that does the same thing, more or less. Or you can just plug the NeoPixel string that I showed you just a moment ago directly into the box from the video before. These are all kind of modular elements of the same project, and it's really interesting that Hashi has chosen this project to kind of focus in on multiple ways of doing it. By the way, the aforementioned strings of WS2811 strings, 50 pieces are $12 from eBay. This link is in his video description just down here somewhere. There we go. And if you want to get a huge amount of them, you can get 1,000 of them for $210, which is probably very, very good. Or you can spend $144 to get 500 of them, plus a pretty beefy power supply. Although, of course, if you have all of your own stuff, you could probably get away with just having 50 of them if you have a decent power supply already. And again, $12 for essentially that amount of lighting is pretty cool. Have to say tempted, don't have time to do it myself. Anyhow, thanks for joining me on my little rabbit hole dive down the things that HashiTech has been making. I hope you found it as interesting as I did. I will leave a link to this project in the description of the video because the original video is there and links to both of the other videos that we looked at are there. If I could spend more time on this, I would. I love these kind of multiple angles at the same thing projects. And congratulations, Hashi, on a lovely project. I really look forward to seeing what you do with it next. Now, if you are of a certain age, this will be a very nostalgic image to you because it harks back to a time when arcades had physical mechanical horse racing machines in them with tiny little horses that you could bet on using 10 or 20 pence pieces. And of course, whichever horse won would have a payout, and it was picked completely at random. This is a recreation of something like that, but with an inventive twist because it pulls all of the information it needs in order to run from Strava, the popular exercise app. It uses their online API to pull distance measurements down from different athletes to decide how far along the track the runners run. This isn't so much a who gets there first, it's who gets the farthest. I don't know if you can hear that. There's some incredibly loud birds sitting right outside my window. I mean, don't get me wrong, it's lovely, but they're very, very loud. And I'm not shutting the window. It is 30 degrees here. Okay, that was a nice distraction. This project is from Lorraine Underwood at Element 14. I'm sure you're familiar with the Element 14 community. They make some fantastic projects, fantastic tutorials. Their website has a fantastic community on it as well. And I'm not going to spend too much time going into the design and make of this because Lorraine's video is just fantastic. It goes through the overview. This is exactly what I was just talking about. The horse racing machines that, I have fond memories of being small and being allowed to bet because it's Okay, it is gambling, I suppose, but in a very small sense. And the overview of exactly how it will work, with some fantastic diagrams of how this thing will all fit together, the design, making everything through, using CAD software in order to design it all, to the build, to the Arduino code. Everything is here. It is a wonderfully put together video. So in terms of the hardware design, I absolutely say, please, once you've watched this video, just go and watch her fantastic video, which is embedded in the Arduino blog, which I will be linking down below. But yes, in short, we have this fantastic mechanical system which will move the runners, and then whenever you want the race to run, you can press a button and it will pull the details down from 4 different athletes on Strava. On Strava, everyone is an athlete, which I quite like, and it will look at how far they've run in the last 4 weeks. And just depending on how far they have run, I think it does some clever scaling as well, because if someone's run like 100 kilometers in the last 4 weeks, then you need 100 kilometers to be the end baseline, right? And so if someone's run 100 kilometers and then the other 3 people have just run 20, 20, and 10, the 100 kilometers will go 100% of the way or something like that. Or maybe it doesn't work like that at all. Don't believe me? Again, go and look at Lorraine's fantastic video on the Element 14 channel. And I'm not subscribed to this? Oh, this is my... Okay, yeah. Sometimes people kind of say, hey, why are you talking about this amazing thing if you're not subscribed to it? I have a completely separate YouTube channel that I use for this show, because it means I don't have a million notifications for things that are not to do with this show. But every now and again I see, how am I not subscribed to this channel? And it's because, yes, this is not meant to be. So, you can probably tell things are a little bit hot up here, because at this time of year, Ian loses his mind for a couple of months, and the Electromaker show gets very loose and sweaty. But yes, this is a fantastic project using an Arduino Uno board with Wi-Fi, the Wi-Fi version of the board, revision 2, if I remember correctly from reading this, and a bunch of fantastic hardware. I think it's a project that a lot of people will love, so yeah, I'll leave a link to it in the description of the video. Let me know what you think of it. If you are enjoying the Electromaker show, it would mean a lot to us if you could just take a moment to check that you are subscribed to the Electromaker YouTube channel. Also, liking this video does not just show us that you like it, it shows YouTube that you like it, and makes it far more likely that they will recommend us to other people using their magic algorithm that runs all things. Also, there is a little drop-down menu now next to subscribe. When you have subscribed to a channel, you can turn notifications on, and if you turn them to all, you will get a notification just inside your browser in the top right whenever we put out a new video on this channel. That's usually only an Electromaker show every week and a product of the week every other week, unless we're at a conference when it'll be full of fun interviews and seeing things on the conference floor, but that only happens once or twice a year. I know that people asking for YouTube likes and subscriptions gets a little bit old, but there is a reason that we do it, and I'd like to thank you in advance for doing so. That said, there is a far better way that you can support this show, and that is simply by going to the Electromaker shop when you have your next project in mind. Whether you're buying your first hobby kit for someone who's getting into Arduino, or needing an industrial amount of something for your work, or you have a very specific hobby project that you're looking to get started, check electromaker.io/shop first just to see if we have it, because that financially supports the show directly. We do not run any ads on our videos, we do not have any sponsored sections in our podcast, we don't have like a Patreon or anything like that, we just have a shop. So if you are enjoying the show and want to support us in a very concrete way, that's absolutely the best way that you can do so. Alright, thanks for your patience during this sort of advert for the show that you're already watching, I suppose. Let's get back to it. Now we're going to move on to the part of the show called Funding Website Things, and we're going to find ourselves on crowd supply as we so often do. Now, if you're not familiar with crowd supply, think Kickstarter, but just for cool hardware projects, development kits, all that kind of stuff. For example, the MNT Reform, which is probably one of the more famous projects from the site, was funded on crowd supply instead of Kickstarter. That's the idea behind it. And we're going to look at a very interesting M.2 Slot micro SDR board today. But just before we do, I want to talk about EPI32U4. I'm going to talk about it extremely briefly because we have covered it before in a previous Electromaker show and when it was first announced, and I'll leave a link to that in the description of this video. But just a very quick recap, as it says, it's an extremely compact Arduino compatible ATmega32U4 USB Type-C development board. I'm sorry if I keep glancing over there, I thought I'd stop my recording by accident. Yeah, I mean, that's sort of what it says on the tin. Now, the ATmega32U4 is the chip found in the Arduino Leonardo and Pro Micro, which has become a saying on this show. Basically, a slightly more powerful version of the chip in the Arduino Uno, but with native USB. It can be a USB HID device, which is useful. This is a much smaller version of it with castellated edges, USB Type-C, and again, I talked about it in the past. The only reason I wanted to come back to it is because they are now funding. They did the classic $1 goal just to kind of get it up and running. They've actually raised $688 in order to get this thing off the ground. If you are interested in finding out more, there'll be a link to this in the description, the previous time I talked about it in the description, and if you would like to get a hold of one, this USB Type-C very tiny development board has two versions of it, both $25. One is the 16 megahertz version, which is $25, and one is an 8 megahertz version, which is also $25. Why would you want to pay more for a version that runs slower? Well, because it runs on a much lower power draw. It needs only 2.7 volts rather than the full 5 that the other one does. And I believe that is all I need to say about it from now, because as I said, I talked about this with a bit more length when it first came out, but links to both of those things will be in the description of this video. Now, moving on to micro SDR. Now, whenever I talk about software-defined radios, I quickly get out of my depth because it's not my field of expertise. It's not something I know about. It's also something that is quite difficult to get into from a hobbyist perspective, unless you've got a lot of time to work on it or some background in engineering or radio. And micro SDR is hoping to change that. The idea, as it says, it's a tiny single-sided M.2 Slot variant or form factor software-defined radio board, and it has a web browser interface. Which is a very useful thing. I'm sure you'll be able to get it working with your normal software if you need to. Also, by the way, they have a meme-heavy and quite fun video in terms of launching it, as you're seeing right now. And they also are selling this development board as well. This is a USB board which allows you to slot it directly into the computer and start working with it. Of course, it being M2, I imagine you could attach it to pretty much anything that fits the M2B as a form factor, I believe it is. We'll check that later. But what you're seeing now, very briefly, they skipped over it there. You go to their website and you can basically click on any one of these things and get it up and running straight away. So you're seeing here live in the browser a spectrogram and various other things that are interesting to those who are working with software-defined radios. And this thing has a range of frequencies that it works at. Again, so I don't fully understand the legality of it all and how it can work in different countries, but it does seem to have a decent range. Of course, that's all going to be down to where you're setting it up and what kind of area you have as well, I imagine. However, the things that people are going to be most interested in is how easy is this to use? How can you get it working? Yeah, as you're seeing, this thing even, you can just plug it into a phone and do it that way because web browser. Now, the features and specifications for those who are interested in them. This is an M.2 Slot 2230 key A and E interface, full duplex transmission and receiving. The frequency range is from 300 to 3700 megahertz. The usable range typically starts at 230 megahertz. The receiving and transmitting bandwidth is 0.75 to 28 megahertz plus bypass mode, whatever that means. Again, not my field of expertise. Clock stability of 0.5 ppm and a sample rate of up to 30.72 megasamples per second, 40 plus megasamples per second in bypass mode. High-speed USB 2 at 480 megabits per second, streaming at 15 megasamples per second, half duplex, or 5 to 6 megasamples per second, full duplex. Now, I want to be sure for a second that I'm not saying that wrong, because megasamples per second, or is that million samples per second? Ian's going to do some research. Ah, good. So let's move on. There's a bunch of different host interfaces for it as well, but let's talk about the actual thing itself. So this is a thing that I thought was quite interesting. They're talking about the fact that they've wanted to do this for a while, but it took 3 hardware revisions to just get it right. The main challenge was to ensure proper signal integrity and to fit all of the components on just one side of the board. Presumably the idea being is that if this is an M.2 slot device, you don't want components pushing against the board underneath it, I'm assuming. And there's a wealth of information on this page, which is stuff that I'm sure if you are already interested in the software-defined radio field, you will find interesting. If you are not so interested in it like me, this all looks very, very nice, but I still am most impressed by that video at the top where they put their software-defined radio into their USB port and then opened up a browser that had a bunch of stuff that was just working for them automatically. If I'm going to get into software-defined radio, that's the way it's going to be, much in the same way that someone who wants to get into hardware at all in the first place is going to have a much better time plugging an Arduino in and opening the Arduino IDE, or using a make block browser based thing with a microbit, or using a Raspberry Pi Pico and Thonny, you know, the easy route in. That's what's going to get people hooked, and that's what I find interesting about this. Now, there's a lot more to this page. There's a USB adapter, as I mentioned already, which has aerial inputs and outputs just there. There's also a development board, which can fit into the PCI slot of your computer. There's a bunch of interesting things here. That's not to say anything of the fact that as it says here, they've developed a project which is a cellular 2G network that works in your browser as an example project for how you can actually get this thing up and running in a useful sense. And there's much more I haven't even had time to mention. But what I did want to mention is the price. So the micro SDR is $299 for just the M.2 slot. Now, before you throw your hands up and say, whoa, that's a crazy amount of money, I believe that's still $100 cheaper than the Lime SDR Micro, which is another software-defined radio board. Although I think the difference there is if I remember correctly, the Lime SDR was actually a USB board in and of itself with the aerials on, and that's something that you would have to buy separately. So, but then again, look, their USB adapter is just $39. So for the $299 plus the $39 plus the mini PCI adapter, which I assume you'll also need, you're still looking at less than the cost of the Lime SDR. And again, I'm not trying to put one against the other. I'm just trying to say this is how much these things seem to cost. This is a quite complex FPGA on board both boards, doing a very difficult task. And making these things in small batches, which they're going to presumably have to do, is not a cheap thing. You're not making a small development board using an incredibly cheap chip you can buy in large quantities. It's something a bit different here. So with my little soapbox moment out of the way, the early adopters kit is $997, which seems to have one of everything that they make. So that's the M2 board, and then the M2 adapter board, the USB board, and the PCI slot for putting into your main desktop if you want to work with it that way. I can see this being something for people who really are serious about working with this piece of kit. I could see someone getting one of these and an extra one of these, because then they can just leave one in their computer at all times, and then have another one which plugs into USB ports and phones and tablets so that they can do testing or something like that, as a guess. And the development board is $277. There's a couple of other objects here that you might be interested in too. So now that you know the price, you know if you want to support this project. If you're already into software-defined radios, maybe this is something that isn't for you because you probably already got your own setup. But if you have been looking for a way into it, this does seem like as good a way in as any, especially given that they're trying to make it as accessible as possible. I'm not qualified to tell you if this is better in any way than other projects like Lime SDR that I've already mentioned, but it certainly is the one that made me go, oh, okay, if I did have $1,000 to throw at something like this, I absolutely would. It just doesn't make any sense for me right now with the negative time that I have in my life, given that I have two small children and a weekly YouTube show to do. So I'm going to talk about it rather than fiddle with it, sadly. However, if you would like to support the project, they have currently raised $22,000 of their $100,000 goal. Again, they are working with very expensive parts. I presume that's why they're trying to raise enough money to really get this thing off the ground. So if you would like to help with that, there's 35 days left on the funding, and you can find a link to it in the description of this video. It is time to announce the winner of the competition that we started last week for the product of the week, the Grove infrared camera. Now, in case you need a quick reminder about that, I will leave a link in the description to our product of the week article about it. It, as always, has the embedded wonderful video from our in-house gadget guru and educator, Robin Mitchell, who is actually an engineer, knows far more that he's talking about than I do, and even does full sentences without stumbling all over his words like I have been for the majority of this episode. But yes, this is an inexpensive infrared array, which is kind of amazing because most of the modules that you see that are kind of worth buying are up above $100. This is only $26, I think, at the time of writing, and yet it still gives a pretty decent image. And so, yeah, it's an interesting thing. But anyway, if you'd like to know more about that, you can watch last week's show, find the link in the description. What we're here to do is announce the winner of the contest. And the winner this week is Jeff Estrella Comedy. I'm assuming you're someone called Jeff Estrella who does comedy. If so, cool. I used to do stand-up and host shows and a lot of that kind of stuff before I had kids. And I'm hoping to get back into it when I have nights again. And I also do hardware. And as you know, if you do both of these things, both are very humbling and can make you feel very stupid depending on how well it is going. So Jeff says, wow, this is great. The first thing that comes to mind is detecting temperature hotspots on motors, steppers, and bearings, and pulleys for preventative maintenance on machines. machines, which is a very interesting idea. It hadn't really occurred to me that you could just leave this in place at a point in a machine that is prone to heat failure, and then perhaps even set up some kind of clever code that if any point on the thermal array goes above a certain level, it will ring some kind of alarm. It's very interesting, very worth knowing. So congratulations, Jeff. We will be in touch with you as to how you can get this prize. And yes, if you are still doing stand-up, best of luck with that too. I'm hoping to get back to it myself soon. And thank you to everyone who entered this competition. There will be another product of the week coming up quite soon, and as always, we will be giving it away. But for now, let's get on with the rest of the show. We are going to close out the show by talking about Milk5, a Chinese company that are putting out RISC-V development boards. And they have a Raspberry Pi form factor development board, for example, and that's by far not the first RISC-V board that has been Raspberry Pi form factor, not even the first that we've talked about on this show. What makes Milk5 interesting is that they're targeting all parts of the market. Yes, they have their Raspberry Pi form factor board, but if you go smaller, they have a Raspberry Pi Pico form factor board, which is a very interesting looking $9 MCU development board, which can apparently run Linux on one core and RTOS on the other. According to their website, this is all hearsay so far because they're not available in the West yet. However, on the other end of the scale, and perhaps the most interesting, is the Milk5 Pioneer, which is a full-on mini ATX style motherboard for a computer featuring a RISC-V server chip and a bunch of potential peripherals. And we find ourselves back on CrowdSupply, weirdly enough. This is a pre-launch project on CrowdSupply, but it is from Milk5, and this is the Pioneer board that we're seeing in front of us. And I'll see if I can make it just a little bit bigger. And yes, it does look like a motherboard. It is a motherboard, a mini ATX style board, with the Sophon server chip in the middle. We'll talk about that a little bit more in a moment. Up to 128 gigabytes of RAM and a bunch of different slots that you would usually find on a normal motherboard. Now, there is an introduction video here which goes through all of the specs. If you are interested in finding them, I will whip through them. I usually skip over them, but I feel like this is worth going through because general computer specs is something that more people are familiar with, I feel like, even people who watch this show. Although, needless to say, right off the bat, this is not going to be as powerful as the gaming computer that you built, or even the gaming laptop that you have, or maybe even just your bog standard but higher end computer of any kind that you buy. But the whole point of this is that this is a developer's computer, but not just in the the little form factor Raspberry Pi style. This is a developer's computer right up to the motherboard style to size, and even as you're going to see later in this not later in this article, right here, there even is a variant that's going to come in its own box, which allows you to basically have a fully fledged desktop mini ATX style that you can carry around. And I can actually give you a size reference. This beautiful machine, which sadly died, is the machine that I used to make the first 100 or so episodes of the first 50 or so episodes of the Electromaker show, perhaps. But this is the form factor size that we are talking about. So it is small enough to transport. In fact, I built this computer in England and took it in hand luggage back to Germany with me. It was one of the reasons I got a micro ATX computer in the first place. And yeah, the form factor is kind of interesting. It is a full-size motherboard. There's an incredibly chunky early NVIDIA card in there, GeForce, I can't remember what it was, 1080 or something. But yeah, that managed to fit in here and presumably would fit into there as well. So yeah, I just wanted to give you a size reference. Anyway, that distraction aside, let's try and get through this a little bit quickly because it is very hot in here. I am sweating and making less and less sense the more I speak. So we have a full motherboard based on a RISC-V chip. As it says here, the SG2042 server chip is based on the RISC-V instruction set architecture with 64 cores and is designed to meet high-performance computing needs. The characteristics of the SG2042 server chip include scalability, flexibility, and customization. It incorporates ICs such as a high-speed cache, memory controllers, network interfaces, PCI Express controllers, and support for general-purpose operating systems such as Linux. And if you do watch the introduction video, it does show you a version of Fedora running on it. Which is, a fully fledged operating system for Linux that many people use. Some of you are maybe watching this on a Fedora system. Judging by the fact that I'm not sure how they've captured the media from it, it does seem like it runs medium quality videos at a fairly high clip. In fact, you're about to see he's going to run 2 at one time. So The specifications here, as it mentioned, the Sofon SG2042 64-core C920 RVV 0.71 chip. All of those numbers at the end, I don't know what that means. You can choose your own adventure with those. It has 4 DDR4 DIMM slots, so that's up to 128 gigabytes of RAM, 3 PCIe times 16 slots, so PCI 3 times 8. 5 SATA connectors, and it is 24 by 24 centimeters. It has a standard ATX power connector, 2 RJ45 2.5 gigahertz connectors, 1 M.2 E key for wireless connectivity, 8 USB 3s, 1 USB header for the front panel, as you find in most desktops, 1 USB debug console, and it also has a miscellaneous header for the front panel, so for power, reset, and LEDs, an SPI flash for the BIOS, micro SD card for recovery or OS loading, and 2 M.2 M key slots, which is PCI 3 times 4. So the page goes on to talk about what you get in the Pioneer box as well, and that's all there is to say about this, more or less, so far. Now, we're going to switch over from the Crowd Supply page to the Milk 5 site. I just wanted to note that this is on Crowd Supply, so if you would like to find out more specifically about this project, you can do the same thing you always do. You can put your name in the box here, click subscribe, and you will get updates whenever there is an update to this project. So, the Milk 5 Pioneer, this is the page on milk5.io/pioneer. You can find this, I'll be linking this page for the other 2 development boards we're about to talk about, and you can find the Pioneer up here. One thing that is worth noting as well, if you look under the docs page, there are already a few scanned docs available for the Pioneer if you're interested in diving through them. I've had a quick look through them, which is very basic boilerplate getting started with the board itself. And yeah, you know, it's very much like a regular motherboard. You put the thermal paste on the chip, you put your cooler on it, and then, you know, you do all of the homework before you boot it up to get it to work. There's a bit of information about the chip itself too. Note that there's a link to the technical reference manual, which is also completely open sourced. So yeah, that is all here as well, although as it stands right now, oh yeah, okay, more pages. I was going to say, as it stands right now, there's not much to it there. But yeah, it does appear that it is all there. So, that's the Pioneer, and I wish I could have covered it in more depth, but we have 2 more boards to talk about. So the Milk 5 Mars, and I think this is the one that, or one of the 2 that might have a slightly wider appeal to our audience here at Electromaker, given that we're all fans of things like Raspberry Pis and MCUs and all that kind of stuff. This is the Raspberry Pi version of it, and I say Raspberry Pi 3B specifically because it really does have exactly that form factor. It fits the Raspberry Pi 3B form factor so well that I've read elsewhere that you can put any Raspberry Pi 3B case, including heat sinks and coolers, onto it, and it will just work. It's that much of a one-to-one replacement. And as you can see, it does look very, very similar. As far as I can tell, it is exactly the same in terms of inputs and outputs as a Raspberry Pi 3, apart from the fact that it has an M.2 slot, an E key M.2 slot, if I remember correctly. In fact, I can tell you that right now. In terms of connectivity, 1 M.2 E key. Let's go through the entire specs since they're right in front of us. So it has the Start5 JH7110 64-bit system on chip with RV64GC up to 1.5 gigahertz. Again, I don't really know anything about Start5. I don't know anything about these system on chips in terms of their power. It's not going to outpace a Raspberry Pi 4, of course, but that's the whole thing here. That's not what we're going for. This is an entirely open instruction set. I'm not fully certain, but I think the technical reference manual for this chip is available too, and of course, again, RISC-V open instruction set, something that you could get to learn how to do RISC-V assembly, for example, if you wanted to, something we talked about in a show a couple of weeks before. And it comes with 1, 2, 4 or 8 gigabytes of DDR4 RAM. It has an eMMC slot. It also has an SD card slot and an SPI flash for the bootloader. HDMI out, 1 2-lane display port and 1 2-lane camera port. Oh, hang on. That's a little confusing. MIPI, DSI, MIPI, one should say CSI, I'm assuming. But yes, there's an output for, oh no, here we are. Look, camera with MIPI CSI 2-lane. So it's saying 2-lane and 4-lane. I don't fully understand why that is. Max dual display output, 1 HDMI and 1 MIPI DSI. So presumably maybe that's so you can have 2 different digital displays instead of the HDMI. Time will tell for that one. And H.264 and 265 4K 60 frames per second decoding. Of course, that will have to be tested when this thing is available. H.265 1080 at 30 FPS encoding and a JPEG encoder and decoder. It has gigabit Ethernet. It has 3 USB ports and 1 USB 2 port, which I believe is better than the Pi 3 was, because I think that only had 2 and 2. And it had the it also has the aforementioned M.2 E-key slot. Along with the 40-pin GPIO and, of course, the exact dimensions of the Raspberry Pi 3B. And I wish there's more I could tell you right now, but that's all there is to it. And in fact, if you do click the Buy Now link, this is coming soon and coming soon. Same with, by the way, if you try and click the Buy Now link on the Pioneer page, there's this crowd supply page, which is coming soon. And yeah, there's no way you can actually get this anywhere in the world. It's just an announcement as it stands right now. Also, if you head to the documents page for this, there's just absolutely nothing on the Mars quite at this stage. Of course, this is something worth checking back to. I imagine the documentation for this will pop up pretty much as soon as this thing becomes available in China, so you'll be able to get a quick look at what kind of documentation it has. And as with all things like this, I imagine that documentation will continue to be updated for some time after its release. At least one would hope. And now the Duo. And out of all of them, I think this is the one that is the most interesting to me, mostly because at only $9, it's something that I could get a hold of and not feel so bad if I only dipped into it and didn't have so much time to use it. This is, as you can see, their take on the Raspberry Pi Pico. It does have a couple of extra inputs and outputs that the Raspberry Pi Pico does not. But yeah, it's based on that form factor. However, what makes it interesting is, as you can see here, it supports asymmetric multiprocessing. The idea being that this is a dual-core RISC-V chip where you can run Linux on one of the cores if you like, and an RTOS on another one of the cores in order to do separate tasks. Presumably you could have Linux as your main system doing things and the RTOS doing all of the heavy lifting for the inputs and outputs, making sure everything happens on time, and of course sharing the same memory, I would imagine, as well. And again, let's just jump straight down to the specs. So it has a CVI Tech CV1800B chip, which is something I've never heard of before. Again, RISC-V, dual RV64 core, up to 1 gigahertz in speed, 64 megabytes of RAM. Interestingly, I don't know if that 64 gigabytes of RAM is on board. If it is, that's kind of impressive. But maybe it exists inside the chip. Presumably that's what it is, actually. The system on chip has the 64 megabytes of RAM built into it, which is a chunky amount of RAM for such a tiny little board like this. Provides 10 to 100 megabits per second Ethernet via an optional add-on board, and the technology supports running both Linux and RTOS as previously mentioned. And yeah, this one is available, but only in mainland China currently. If you click Buy Now, again, China mainland, but AliExpress is not happening quite yet. It is also mentioning coming soon. But this is one of the ones where if you dive into the docs, there is a little bit of information on Duo. There's an overview, there's a getting started guide if you'd like to dive in and find a little bit more about that. And yeah, obviously, as you're seeing here, this does have a little bit more on board than a Raspberry Pi Pico. And in fact, this documentation page has slightly more in-depth specifications here as well. You can see that the RAM is DDR2. You can see that it has a micro SD card slot, which is presumably this here, or maybe it's on the underside. And it has a camera connector as well, just here. I believe that's a MIPI CSI 2-lane connector. So it's actually, if you kind of think of it in reverse, it's double the price of a Raspberry Pi Pico. In fact, it costs about the same as a Raspberry Pi Pico W, but it doesn't have the connectivity. But it's a seemingly crazy powerful chip. Again, this is something where if you want to go toe-to-toe with this RISC-V chip and the Cortex M0 Plus that I believe the RP2040 is based upon, I just don't honestly know. But it is definitely an interesting alternative. And as mentioned, I just found the idea that Milk 5 is throwing out all of these announcements at once a very interesting thing, and was definitely worth mentioning. It's if you pay attention to the sort of maker hobby computer sphere, it has been mentioned by quite a few people, and there's a lot of very interesting articles out there. So yeah, I also suggest seeing how the other people have reported on it. The various CNX software articles obviously go into a lot more technical detail, and there's various different attitudes and ideas as to how this is going to work. I am hoping that all three of these are things that are affordable to the people that will be interested in them. So this one is perfect for me. The idea of the Duo, being a $9 board, it has all of these interesting ways of working with it, and is also a RISC-V board, ticks all the right boxes for me. As does the Raspberry Pi form factor one. No price on that quite yet. Presumably $70 to $90 to $100. but who knows. And then the Pioneer, which is the big chunk, which is going to be very interesting to a smaller number of people. But again, that I just love the idea of that portable box they have, the Pioneer box here, which comes with a graphics card and a few other things as well. So yeah, I'm going to leave it at that. There will be links to all of these things in the description of the video, from the crowd supply page I mentioned at the start through to Milk5's website. And of course, once you're on the website, you can get to everything I've talked about through the docs. If you'd like to find out more about any of those things, you can. And I would be very interested to see what all of you think of this, and of course, anything else that was featured on this week's show. So that was our show for this week. Thank you so much for joining me. Thank you for all the support that you've been showing us. Thank you for making sure that you're subscribed to the channel and all of that YouTube nonsense. And I'd love to know what you think of Milk5. I mean, most of the stuff we covered on this show is the stuff that we normally cover, and I'm always very interested to hear your opinions on different things. I know whenever we talk about software-defined radio, there's a bit more talk in the chat, because I think a lot of people get into software-defined radio without necessarily looking into the local laws to them, and there are some local laws that may mean that certain hardware you buy is actually illegal to use where you are. Always do your research first. But yes, Milk5 is a very interesting prospect just because they've thrown all these things out at once. And I'd love to hear your opinions on it, or if there's any other people doing exactly what they're doing but better. As always, there's always space for it on a future Electromaker show. But yeah, thank you so much for joining me this week. I will see you next time. I hope you have a fun, safe and creative week. Bye-bye.